October 1865, the war's end and the beginning of silence. In the small parish of St. Clement, the Holloways donated new stained glass windows to cleanse the past. During the renovation of the floor, the sacristan heard knocking from below. 3, always 3. When the central plank was lifted, the men stepped back. A female skeleton, carefully arranged beneath the pulpit. A gold locket caught between the ribs with a miniature of a young woman and a name engraved on the worn metal. Judith. In the parish books there was no baptism, marriage or death under that name. In the vicar's diary only the terrified note, "She has been here for years," and no one listened. The following night, the bells tolled 13 times at midnight, though the ropes had been cut. Cattle rotted within minutes, the milk curdled in its jars, and every Holloway child woke with a raw throat, unable to pronounce the word forgiveness. They tried to bless the bones, but the ground spat the coffin back out as if the church were breathing in reverse. Every attempt to bury her elsewhere brought Judith back, always beneath the family's sermon. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. Letters confiscated by the parish priest said that in 1843, a Holloway bride vanished on the eve of her wedding, taken to silence a shame, and yet the locket showed the same face in portraits across 3 generations. Today, anyone who kneels at the third pew swears they feel cold air rising between the boards and hear a whisper that splits the wood. I was not forgotten. I was placed here for you to tread upon me. They say that if you lift the most worn plank before the pulpit, you will find a gold ring waiting and tooth marks on the bone that is still trying to tell the rest of the story. The morning after the bells tolled 13 times, Millbrook woke to find the world slightly wrong. It was nothing dramatic, no blood-red skies or swarms of locusts, but rather a collection of small impossibilities that accumulated like frost on a window until the entire town felt the cold. Martha Holloway noticed it first. She'd risen at dawn, as always, heading to the kitchen to prepare breakfast for her husband Thomas and their 3 children. The milk sat in its ceramic pitcher on the counter, delivered fresh from the Hendersons' dairy farm just the evening before. But when Martha poured it into her coffee, it came out in thick grey curds that smelled of rot and something metallic. She checked the other jar. Same result. Both had been sealed, both kept cool. There was no rational explanation. "Thomas!" she called, her voice tight with unease. "Something's wrong with the milk." Thomas descended the stairs, already dressed, his face drawn from a sleepless night. The bells had woken him too, and he'd spent the dark hours staring at the ceiling, thinking about the donation he'd made to St. Clement's, about the renovation that was supposed to cleanse the past, about the body they'd found beneath the pulpit. He examined the spoiled milk without touching it. "I'll speak to Henderson. Perhaps his cows are sick." But when he visited the Henderson farm an hour later, he found something far worse than sick cattle. James Henderson stood in his barn, staring at 5 Holstein cows that had been healthy the night before. Now they lay on their sides in pools of their own waste, bodies already beginning to bloat with gases, flies gathering in black clouds. The stench was overwhelming, not the gradual decay of natural death, but an accelerated putrefaction, as if something had reached inside these animals and fast-forwarded their decomposition by weeks. "I don't understand," Henderson kept repeating, his weathered face slack with shock. "I checked them at midnight. They were fine. I came out at dawn and found them like this." Thomas felt ice crystallize in his chest. Midnight. The bells. "Have you called the veterinarian?" "Dr. Morris is on his way, but Thomas—" Henderson turned to him, and in his eyes was something Thomas hadn't seen directed at his family in years: suspicion. "My boy heard the bells last night, 13 of them, and he said, He said he saw your youngest, Grace, standing in our south pasture at moonrise, just standing there in her nightgown, not moving. When he called to her, she turned and walked back toward your house, but he swears her feet never touched the ground. That's impossible. Grace was in bed, was she? Henderson's voice hardened. Because my cows were fine until those bells rang, and folks are saying they rang from St. Clement's where they found that body. The body under the floor your family paid to renovate. Thomas left without another word, but Henderson's accusation followed him like a shadow. By noon, news had spread through Millbrook with the efficiency of wildfire. 5 households reported spoiled milk. The butcher's meat turned grey overnight. The baker found his flour crawling with weevils that hadn't been there at closing. And every incident seemed to radiate outward from the Holloway properties, their house, their businesses, the church they'd attended for 3 generations. Reverend Ashford found Thomas in the church office, sitting with his head in his hands. "They're blaming us," Thomas said without looking up. "The whole town thinks my family brought this curse. Thomas, we need to discuss what Jacob found. The body—" "I know nothing about anybody," Thomas's voice cracked with desperation. "My family has served this church faithfully. We've donated, we've attended every service, we've—" "Your father," Ashford interrupted quietly. "Did he ever speak of 1843? The colour drained from Thomas's face. "What?" "A Holloway bride who vanished. The night before her wedding, I found a reference in Reverend Blackwood's diary. He wrote that she was taken to silence a shame." Thomas stood abruptly, knocking his chair backward. "Old gossip, rumours. My father dismissed that servant girl who spread those lies. What was her name? I don't—" Thomas stopped, his mouth working soundlessly. He'd been about to say he didn't remember, but the name was suddenly there, clear as a bell. Judith. Ashford watched the realization break across Thomas's face like dawn. "The locket," the Reverend said softly, "the miniature inside. I've seen that face before, Thomas. In your family's portrait gallery. No." But Thomas's denial carried no conviction. Because he'd seen it too, the moment Jacob showed him the locket. The same dark hair, the same haunting eyes that appeared in 3 generations of Holloway paintings, his great-aunt Margaret, his grandmother Elizabeth, and the unnamed woman in the oldest portrait, the one his father had always deflected questions about. "We need to bury her properly," Ashford said. "Give her peace. Perhaps then—" "Yes!" Thomas seized on this, desperate for any action that might stop the rot spreading through his life. "Yes! We'll hold a proper Christian burial, today, before sunset." They commissioned a coffin from Jacob Miller, who worked in grim silence, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The bones were transferred carefully, reverently, the gold locket placed atop the folded hands. Ashford prepared a brief service, pulling verses about forgiveness and eternal rest. At 4 o'clock, a small procession gathered at St. Clement's Cemetery. Thomas and his family, Reverend Ashford, Jacob Miller and his sons. A handful of curious townspeople who kept their distance, watching with the wariness of people who suspected they were witnessing something unholy. The grave had been dug in the Holloway family plot between Thomas's grandparents. The coffin was lowered with ropes. Ashford began to read, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." A sound interrupted him, low at first, then rising, a groan from deep in the earth, like the planet itself objecting to what they were attempting. The coffin shifted. "Keep going," Thomas urged, his voice breaking. "Please, keep going. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake." The groan became a roar. The earth around the grave began to tremble, dirt sliding inward. The coffin lurched upward, rising inch by impossible inch, as if the ground were breathing in reverse, expelling what they'd tried to enter. "Jesus Christ," William Miller whispered. The coffin cleared the grave lip and tipped sideways, spilling open. The bones scattered across the grass, and the locket tumbled free, catching the late afternoon sun. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the movement stopped. Everyone stood frozen, staring at the impossible scene. The earth had rejected her. The grave would not hold. Ashford made the sign of the cross with trembling hands. "This is beyond my power to fix." They tried twice more over the next 3 days. Different locations. The public cemetery, an unused corner of Thomas's estate, even a plot in the woods beyond town limits. Each time, the result was the same. The earth convulsed. The coffin rose. The bones returned, as if Judith had been tethered to St. Clement's Church by chains stronger than death. On the third night, Thomas's eldest son, Michael, developed a fever, then Catherine, his daughter, then Grace, the youngest. By morning, all 3 children lay in their beds with raw, swollen throats, unable to speak above a whisper. Dr. Morris examined them with growing confusion. "There's no infection, no inflammation that I can see. It's as if their vocal cords have been damaged, but there's no physical cause." "Can they speak at all?" Martha asked, gripping her husband's arm. "Try," Morris urged gently, addressing young Grace. "Tell me your name." "Grace Holloway," the girl rasped, each word clearly causing pain. "Good. Now, can you say hello? Hello? And goodbye? Goodbye." Morris nodded, writing notes. "Now try this. I need forgiveness." Grace's mouth opened. Her lips formed the shape of the words, but when she reached the final word, nothing emerged. She tried again, her face reddening with effort, tears streaming down her cheeks. The word would not come. Morris tested the other children. Same result. They could say anything, speak freely, until they attempted that one specific word. Then their voices simply stopped. "What kind of illness affects only a single word?" Martha demanded, her voice rising toward hysteria. The doctor had no answer. That night, Thomas returned to St. Clement's alone. The bones had been placed back in the crawlspace beneath the pulpit. No one knew what else to do with them, and the floorboards remained lifted, the gap like an open wound in the church floor. He knelt at the edge, lantern in hand, and stared down at the skeleton arranged with such terrible care. "What do you want?" he whispered. "What do you want from us?" The bones gave no answer, but in the lantern light, the shadows seemed to shift and rearrange themselves. Thomas thought of his father, dead 5 years now, and the stories the old man had refused to tell. He thought of that servant girl who'd disappeared, the bride who'd never made it to her wedding, the shame that had been buried beneath beauty and donation, and 3 generations of faithful church attendants. "I didn't know," he said, though he wasn't sure if it was true. There had been whispers his whole life, gaps in family stories, portraits hung in dim hallways where visitors wouldn't ask questions. I was a child. It wasn't my sin. But sins, he was learning, do not confine themselves to the guilty. They spread like rot through families, through time, contaminating everything they touch until someone finally has the courage to face them. Thomas reached down and picked up the locket. In the flickering light, Judith's painted eyes seemed alive, accusing. "Tell me," he pleaded, "tell me what happened to you." The church remained silent, but outside, somewhere in the October darkness, cattle were dying in fields they'd grazed peacefully for years. Milk was curdling in sealed containers, and 3 children lay unable to speak the one word that might save them all: forgiveness. The word the dead woman beneath the church floor had never received. Reverend Samuel Ashford spent the 4th night in his study, surrounded by every document saint Clement's had preserved since its founding. Parish records, donor logs, baptismal certificates, a paper trail of piety that should have contained some mention of Judith. But she existed in none of them, as if an entire life had been methodically erased, except. His eyes kept returning to Reverend Josiah Blackwood's personal diary, that single cryptic entry from 1843. "She has been here for years, and no one listened." If Judith had been buried beneath the church in 1843, as the entry suggested, then Blackwood had known. Perhaps he'd even known before her death. Known what was being planned. Ashford rose and moved to the study window. The church stood across the small courtyard, its white-clapboard sides ghostly in the moonlight. Blackwood had lived here too, in this same rectory, sleeping in this same room. What had he heard at night? What had driven him to write those words? There had to be more. Men of God kept records, left evidence. Blackwood had served St. Clement's for 8 years, from 1839 to 1847. One diary entry wasn't enough. There had to be letters, sermons, some trace of what he'd witnessed. The next morning, Ashford enlisted Jacob Miller's help. "The rectory is older than the current church building," he explained, as they stood in the narrow hallway. "When they rebuilt in 1823, they kept the original structure. These walls," he knocked on the plaster, "were here when Blackwood served. If he hid something, it might still be here." Jacob ran his hands along the walls, tapping gently, listening for hollow spaces. They worked through the study, the kitchen, the small bedroom upstairs. Nothing. Then, in the attic, a cramped space under the eaves where ancient trunks held mouldering vestments and forgotten hymnals, Jacob's hammer found a loose board in the wall behind a stack of boxes. "Here," he said. "This sounds different." They pulled away the boxes, revealing a panel that didn't quite match the others. Jacob wedged his crowbar into the gap and pulled. The wood came away with a crack that echoed in the confined space, and behind it a leather satchel sealed with wax that had cracked with age. Ashford's hands shook as he broke the seal. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with ribbon. The paper was yellowed but intact, covered in neat handwriting. He lifted the first bundle into the dim attic light and began to read. October 12th, 1841. To Bishop Aldrich. I write to you in confidence regarding a matter that troubles my conscience deeply. A young woman has come to the rectory 3 times in the past month, seeking sanctuary. She will not tell me her name, but I recognize her. She is employed in the Holloway household as a companion to the late Mrs. Holloway's niece. She claims she is with child, and that the father is a Holloway son. She fears what will happen when the family discovers her condition. I have counseled her to speak truthfully, to trust in the family's Christian charity, but she insists they will not acknowledge the child. She says she has heard them discussing solutions to shameful situations. Your Excellency, I do not know what to do. The Holloways are our most generous benefactors. Without their support, the Church would surely fail. But if this woman speaks truth, can I stand by while... The letter ended there, unsigned, as if Blackwood had lost the courage to finish it. Ashford's throat tightened. He reached for the next letter. November 30th, 1841. To Bishop Aldrich. The young woman returned tonight. She is showing now, perhaps 4 months along. She begs me to perform a marriage in secret. She claims the Holloway son loves her, that he has promised to acknowledge the child if only she will wait, be patient. Let his father's anger cool. I cannot perform such a marriage without the family's consent. The law forbids it, and my position here depends entirely on Holloway goodwill. I gave her what money I could spare, and urged her to seek work elsewhere, in Boston perhaps, where she might start anew. She wept and said, "Father, you are condemning me. They will not let me leave. They will not let me speak." I did not understand what she meant then. God forgive me, I did not understand. Jacob stood beside Ashford, reading over his shoulder. "Sweet Jesus," he murmured. The letters continued, documenting Blackwood's growing horror as he realized what was happening in his parish. By early 1842, the young woman, he'd learned her name was Judith Cartwright, had tried to run. She'd made it as far as the road to Boston before Holloway men brought her back. Blackwood had seen her once more after that, briefly, in the market. She'd worn a high-necked dress despite the summer heat, and when their eyes met, he'd seen the bruises on her throat. July 19th, 1842. She is gone. The Holloways claim she ran away in the night, stole silver and money. They have reported her to the sheriff as a thief. But I know she did not run. I heard her that night, heard her screaming from the Holloway house. I heard and I did nothing. I told myself it was a nightmare, the wind, anything but what I knew it to be. The next morning I went to the house. I demanded to see her. They told me she had left, that they had evidence of her thievery. They showed me the lady's silver, claimed items were missing. They said if I spread rumors, they would see me removed from my position, would ensure I never served in a parish again. I'm a coward. God knows I'm a coward. But what could I do against their power, their wealth, their reputation? The letters became sporadic after that, entries separated by months, then years. Blackwood had returned to his duties, conducted baptisms and funerals, accepted Holloway donations with hands he knew were stained. But he couldn't escape what he'd heard, or what he'd failed to do. November 3rd, 1843. I know where she is. I have known for a year, though I could not admit it to myself. She is beneath us, beneath the pulpit where I stand each Sunday, beneath the feet of the congregation, beneath the prayers we speak to a God who surely no longer listens to this corrupted place. I hear her at night. The floorboards creak, though no one walks above. I feel her rage, her despair, her demand for justice. She was buried there with her child still inside her, silenced forever to protect a family's reputation. I asked Thomas Holloway's father what happened to the girl who vanished. He told me to concern myself with the living, but how can I, when the dead will not stay silent? The final letter was dated January 1847, shortly before Blackwood left St. Clement's. I am fleeing like the coward I am. I cannot bear to stand above her grave one more Sunday, cannot bear to see the Holloway children receive communion with innocent faces while their inheritance is built on murder. I have tried to bless her bones in secret, tried to pray for her soul. But she will not be comforted by my prayers. She wants what I cannot give: acknowledgement, truth, justice. She wants her name spoken aloud, her story told, her child remembered. Let whoever reads this know. Judith Cartwright died at the hands of the Holloway family in 1842. She was 23 years old. She was carrying a child. They buried her beneath the church they claimed to serve, beneath the place where God's word is spoken, thinking the sacred ground would keep her silent. But the sacred ground is only as holy as the men who tend it. And we failed her. I failed her. May God forgive us all, though I know he will not. Ashford let the letter fall. His entire body felt hollow, scraped clean of whatever faith had sustained him through 12 years of service. He'd been tending a gravesite, conducting services above a murdered woman's bones, accepting donations from her killer's descendants. "What are you going to do?" Jacob asked quietly. "I'm going to tell the truth," Ashford said. "All of it." But Jacob shook his head. "The Holloways won't let you. They'll destroy you like they destroyed Blackwood. And what will it change? The girl is still dead. The family is still powerful. Then what? We just let this continue. Let the dead suffer in silence. I'm saying be smart about it. Find proof. Real proof. Letters aren't enough. The Holloways will claim they're forgeries, slander from a disgraced minister." Ashford knew Jacob was right, but the knowledge tasted like ashes. He gathered the letters carefully, securing them in his study. Then he walked to St. Clement's Church, unlocked the door, and stood before the open gap in the floor. "Judith Cartwright," he said to the bones below, "I know your name now. I know what happened to you." The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the floor. In those shadows, for just a moment, Ashford thought he saw a figure, a young woman in a high-necked dress, standing at the pulpit where her murderers had once received blessings. Then she was gone, and only the bones remained. That night, Thomas Holloway found his children's conditions worsening. Their throats had become so raw that even whispers brought tears of pain. Dr. Morris had no explanation, no treatment, and when Martha tried to comfort Grace by singing a lullaby, she found her own voice, catching on certain words, certain phrases, as if something were reaching up from beneath the house and stealing the very sounds from her throat. By dawn, none of the Holloways could speak the word innocent. The curse was spreading word by word, erasing their ability to claim what they'd never truly possessed. Thomas Holloway had not slept in 4 days. Each night he lay in the darkness of his bedroom, listening to his children's labored breathing in the rooms down the hall, feeling his wife's rigid fear in the bed beside him. The house itself seemed to be watching him, waiting for something he could not name. On the 5th morning, he made a decision that terrified him more than anything else he'd faced. He would search his father's papers. The study had been locked since his father's death in 1860. Thomas had the key. He'd carried it on his watch chain for 5 years, but he'd never used it. The room had remained sealed, a shrine to Silas Holloway's memory, filled with the records of business dealings, land acquisitions, and the careful documentation of a life built on reputation and control. Now, as October sunlight struggled through the dust-covered windows, Thomas turned the key and entered his father's sanctuary. The desk dominated the room, a massive oak piece with multiple locked drawers. Thomas had the keys to those too, inherited along with the business, the house, and the weight of family secrets. He'd never looked through them carefully, never wanted to see too deeply into the machinery that had built his comfortable life. He started with the household accounts, ledgers going back to 1838, when his father had first established the family in Millbrook. Income from mills, from investments in railroads, from properties rented to immigrants. Expenditures for the house, for servants, for donations to St. Clement's that were always carefully recorded. October 1839, $200 for new hymnal books. March 1841, $500 toward minister's salary. June 1843, $1,000 for general church maintenance and repair. June 1843. 1 year after Judith Cartwright had disappeared, Thomas pulled out the ledger for 1842, flipping to the household expenses. His father had been meticulous, recording every dollar spent on staff salaries, food supplies, clothing. And there, in the careful handwriting Thomas remembered from his childhood lessons, August 1842, dismissed J. Cartwright, companion to Amelia. No final salary paid. Theft of household items valued at $47. That was all. 1 line to erase a life. Thomas's hands shook as he continued searching. In the back of the desk's deepest drawer, behind folders of property deeds, he found a leather portfolio tied with black ribbon. The leather was soft with age, the ribbon faded. When he opened it, photographs spilled across the desk. Daguerreotypes, the early kind from the 1840s. The first showed a young woman standing beside a marble mantelpiece. She wore a simple dark dress, her hair pulled back severely, and she was beautiful in a way that made Thomas's breath catch. The resemblance to the miniature in the locket was unmistakable, but this image captured something the painting had not: life. Her eyes held intelligence, wariness, and something that might have been hope. On the back, in his father's handwriting, J.C., August 1841. There were 5 more photographs of the same woman. In one, she stood in a garden, half smiling at whoever held the camera. In another, she sat at a piano, hands poised above the keys. In the last photograph, she was fuller in the face, and Thomas realized with creeping horror that she'd been pregnant when it was taken. But it was what he found beneath the photographs that made his stomach turn. A contract, dated September 1841. Witnessed by a Boston lawyer whose name Thomas vaguely recognized from his father's business dealings. Agreement: Miss Judith Cartwright agrees to relinquish all claims to any child born of relations with Robert Holloway. In exchange, the Holloway family will provide a sum of $500 and passage to California, where Miss Cartwright will establish herself under a new name. Miss Cartwright agrees to never contact the Holloway family again and to speak of these circumstances to no one. Violation of these terms will result in legal prosecution for theft and slander. 3 signatures: Judith Cartwright's, in an uncertain hand; Silas Holloways, firm and confident; and Robert Holloways, Thomas's older brother, who died of typhoid in 1845. Robert, the golden son, the one their father had groomed to take over the family business. Thomas had been 12 when Robert died, had worshipped his older brother with the blind devotion of childhood. He'd thought Robert could do no wrong. Now he stared at that signature and saw only the cowardice it represented. There was more. Letters in Robert's hand, stained with what might have been tears or simply time. "Father, she won't sign. She says she loves me, that I promised her marriage. I did promise, I admit it. But I was drunk and foolish, and I never meant— Father, you have to make her understand. If word gets out, I'll be ruined. No decent family will let me near their daughters. You have to fix this." Silas's response was clipped and cold. "I will handle it. Do not contact her again. Do not write anything down. Trust me to do what must be done for this family." Thomas found drafts of other agreements, each offer higher than the last. $500, $800, $1,200. Judith had refused them all. She'd wanted what the law would never give an unmarried woman in 1842: recognition of her child, acknowledgement of the relationship, some measure of security and respect. The final document was a letter from the Boston lawyer, dated November 1842. "Mr. Holloway, I must advise you that I can no longer participate in this matter. The young woman's disappearance has raised questions I am not comfortable answering. I recommend you secure different counsel for any future delicate situations. My records of our transactions will be destroyed as agreed, but I must insist on no further contact." Thomas sat back, the portfolio sliding from his numb fingers. The pieces assembled themselves with terrible clarity. Robert had seduced or raped, that word sat heavy in Thomas's mind, a woman in their household. She'd become pregnant. She'd refused money to disappear quietly, and so his father had made her disappear permanently. Buried beneath the church his father had donated so generously to. Buried where the family could walk over her every Sunday, where her silence would be enforced by sacred ground and the conspiracy of powerful men. "Oh God," Thomas whispered, "oh God, what did you do?" He thought of his own children, unable to speak certain words. He thought of the cattle rotting, the milk curdling, the earth itself rejecting Judith's body. This wasn't random supernatural vengeance. This was precise, targeted. The curse was erasing the Holloways' ability to claim the virtues they'd never possessed, while they'd profited from Judith's silence. A sound from the doorway made him turn. Martha stood there, her face pale, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles were white. "How long have you been there?" he asked. "Long enough." Her voice was flat, emptied of emotion. "Your father murdered that girl. We don't know—" "Yes, we do. Thomas, we do. And our children are paying for it. Our children who did nothing, who weren't even born." Her voice broke, and Thomas saw the terrifying calculation in her eyes. She was a mother first, a Holloway second. And right now, being a Holloway was killing her babies. "What do we do?" she asked. "How do we fix this?" Thomas looked down at the photographs scattered across his father's desk. Judith stared up at him from sepia-toned eternity, forever young, forever pregnant, forever betrayed. "We tell the truth," he said, "all of it. We acknowledge what was done. The town will destroy us. The town is already destroying us. And if we don't stop this, Martha, it won't be just words we lose. You've seen what's happening. The rot is spreading. Soon it won't just be our children who can't speak. It will be everyone connected to our family. Everyone who profits from our name." Martha closed her eyes. "Your father, my father, was a murderer." The words tasted like poison and liberation simultaneously. "And I've been living on blood money my entire life." That afternoon, Thomas went to Reverend Ashford with everything he'd found. They spread the documents across the Reverend's desk, photographs, letters, contracts, the evidence of a crime hidden for 23 years. "This is what Blackwood suspected," Ashford said quietly. "This is what he couldn't prove." "Can we?" Thomas asked. "Can we prove it now, or will people just say I'm fabricating evidence to save my children?" Ashford was silent for a long moment. "Then there's one place we haven't looked." "Where?" "The Holloway family plot, your father's grave." Thomas felt ice slide down his spine. "What do you mean? If Judith was pregnant when she died, there was a child that would have been buried with her or—" Ashford paused, his face grey. "Or buried separately. Your father was a careful man. He wouldn't have left evidence in his grave, but perhaps—" "His mother's grave," Thomas finished, the realization hitting him like a fist. "My grandmother Elizabeth died in 1843, 6 months after Judith disappeared." And they walked to the cemetery as sunset painted the sky blood red. The Holloway plot occupied a prime location, marble headstones announcing generations of respectability. Thomas's grandmother's stone was particularly ornate. His father had spared no expense in mourning her passing. "She died in childbirth," Thomas said slowly, fragments of family history rearranging themselves. "I was told she died birthing a stillborn child. My father never spoke of it." Ashford knelt beside the grave, running his hands over the earth. "Thomas, if we dig, do it." They returned at midnight with shovels, working in silence, the only sound the bite of metal into earth. 3 feet down, Thomas's shovel hit something that wasn't rock. He dropped to his knees, scraping away dirt with his hands. A small wooden box, child-sized, unmarked. Inside, wrapped in a rotting christening gown, were bones, infant bones, decades old, buried in secret in another woman's grave. And pinned to the gown, a note in Silas Holloway's handwriting. "Judith's bastard. May God have mercy on its soul, for I had none to give." Thomas sank back, tears streaming down his face. The child had been born, had perhaps even lived briefly. And his father had buried it here, in a grandmother's grave, where no one would think to look. Erasing not just Judith, but her baby, the evidence of Robert's sin and the family's crime. "We have our proof," Ashford said quietly. Thomas nodded, unable to speak. They carefully reburied the infant's remains. They would be exhumed properly later, with authorities present, and returned to the church. Judith's bones still lay beneath the pulpit, arranged with that terrible care. Thomas knelt at the edge of the opening, holding the photographs he'd found. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "Judith Cartwright, I'm sorry for what my family did to you. I'm sorry for my father's crime, my brother's cowardice, my own years of willful ignorance. I'm sorry you were erased, forgotten, buried beneath the place that should have protected you." The church remained silent. "I'll tell them," Thomas continued. "Tomorrow I'll tell the whole town what happened. Your name will be remembered. Your child will be acknowledged. I'll lose everything, the business, the house, probably my family's future in this town. But you'll be known. The truth will be known." For a moment nothing happened. Then, softly, impossibly, Thomas felt a hand on his shoulder, not threatening, not vengeful, just there, acknowledging. When he turned, no one stood behind him, but in the last light of day, filtering through the stained glass windows, he could swear he saw a figure in a high-necked dress standing at the pulpit. She was smiling, not with joy, but with grim satisfaction. Justice, her expression said, was coming. And justice, Thomas was learning, demanded everything. Sunday morning, October 22nd, 1865. St. Clement's Church filled with congregants unaware that they were gathering for the last sermon Reverend Samuel Ashford would ever deliver from that pulpit, and the first honest one the church had heard in 23 years. Thomas Holloway sat in the third pew with his family, the same seat his father and grandfather had occupied before him. Martha gripped his hand so tightly he'd lost feeling in his fingers. Their children sat between them, throats still raw, voices reduced to painful whispers. Young Grace kept touching her neck, as if trying to feel what had been stolen from her. The church was packed. Word had spread through Millbrook about the Holloway curse: spoiled milk, dying cattle, children who couldn't speak certain words. Some came out of concern, most came out of morbid curiosity. The same instinct that draws crowds to accidents and executions. Jacob Miller sat near the back with his sons, his weathered face grim. He'd helped dig up that tiny coffin from Elizabeth Holloway's grave 2 nights ago, and the sight of those infant bones had stolen something from him, some last shred of faith that powerful men could be trusted to do right. Ashford stood at the pulpit, his sermon notes trembling in his hands. Beneath his feet, separated by mere inches of wood, lay Judith Cartwright's bones. He'd spent the past 3 nights praying for the courage to do what needed to be done, and God, or perhaps Judith herself, had finally answered. He began not with scripture, but with a question. What is a church? The congregation settled, expecting a theological meditation. Ashford's voice was steady, but his knuckles were white as he gripped the pulpit. Is it these walls, these pews, the stained glass that filters God's light into colors we find beautiful? He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the faces below. Or is it the people within, the community of faith that gathers to worship, to confess, to seek forgiveness for their sins? A few murmurs of agreement. Ashford felt sweat bead on his forehead, despite the October chill seeping through the walls. And what happens, he continued, his voice growing stronger, when that community chooses to protect sin instead of confessing it? When the walls themselves become complicit in evil? When the very ground we consecrate to God is used to hide murder? The murmurs stopped. The church went silent. 23 years ago, Ashford said, and his voice now carried to every corner of the building. A young woman named Judith Cartwright worked in the Holloway household as a companion. She was 23 years old. She was intelligent, kind, and by all accounts she was faithful in her attendance at this church. Thomas felt every eye in the building turn toward him. He kept his gaze forward, on Ashford, on the man who was about to destroy everything the Holloway name represented. In 1841, Judith became pregnant. The father was Robert Holloway, eldest son of Silas Holloway. Ashford gestured to the donor plaque bearing Silas's name, the same man whose generosity built the addition to this church, who paid for the organ that plays our hymns, whose name is carved into the marble of our entryway as a pillar of this community. "This is slander," someone shouted from the back. Thomas recognized the voice. William Hartford, one of his father's former business partners. "No," Ashford said quietly. "This is confession, and I beg your patience to hear all of it, for every person in this room has been living with the consequences of what was done, whether they knew it or not." He pulled out the letters, the photographs, the contract. He read sections aloud, carefully avoiding the most explicit details out of respect for the children present, but leaving no doubt about what had transpired: the seduction or rape, the pregnancy, Judith's refusal to simply disappear with money in her pocket and shame on her back, the escalating threats, the final offer from Silas Holloway's lawyer, dated just weeks before Judith vanished from all records. "She disappeared in August of 1842, Ashford continued. "The Holloways claimed she had stolen silver and run away. A search was conducted, but no trace of her was ever found, and life in Millbrook continued as it always had. The Holloways prospered. Robert Holloway died of typhoid 3 years later, and Silas Holloway became even more generous to this church, as if his donations could purchase the silence of God himself." Ashford paused, his hands shaking as he placed the documents on the pulpit. Below him, he felt rather than heard a presence, Judith listening, finally being acknowledged after decades of enforced silence. "Last week, during renovations to this floor, Jacob Miller and his sons found a body buried beneath this pulpit. A female skeleton, carefully arranged, with a gold locket bearing the name Judith. He looked directly at Thomas. The miniature inside that locket matches photographs found in Silas Holloway's private papers. The resemblance to portraits in the Holloway home is unmistakable. And when we attempted to give her a proper Christian burial, the earth itself rejected her. 3 times we tried, and 3 times the ground expelled the coffin, as if the very soil knew it should not be asked to hide this crime any longer. The congregation erupted. Some shouted denials, others demanded proof. A few wept openly. Martha Holloway's hand tightened on Thomas's until he thought his bones would break. Ashford raised his voice above the chaos. 2 nights ago, Thomas Holloway and I exhumed a small box from his grandmother Elizabeth's grave. Inside, we found the remains of an infant, wrapped in a christening gown, with a note in Silas Holloway's handwriting identifying the child as Judith's, the baby she was carrying when she died. The church went silent again, but this was a different silence. The shocked, breathless quiet of people confronting evil they'd never imagined in their midst. "The child was born," Ashford said, his voice breaking. "Perhaps during or after Judith's murder. We will never know. But it was born, and Silas Holloway buried it secretly in his own mother's grave, erasing even that small life to protect his son's reputation and his family's standing in this community." Thomas stood. His legs trembled, but he rose and walked to the front of the church, mounting the steps to stand beside Ashford at the pulpit. His children's eyes followed him, wide and frightened. "It's true," Thomas said, his voice carrying despite the thickness in his throat. "Every word Reverend Ashford has spoken is true. I found the evidence in my father's desk, the photographs, the contracts, the letters. My brother Robert made Judith pregnant and then abandoned her when she wouldn't disappear quietly. My father," his voice cracked, "my father murdered her to protect the family name. And then they buried her here, beneath the place where they came every Sunday to pray, to take communion, to present themselves as righteous men before God and this community." "You're lying." William Hartford was on his feet, red-faced. "Silas Holloway was a good man. You're trying to deflect blame for your own children's condition, making up these wild—" "Then explain the body," Ashford shouted back. "Explain the bones beneath this pulpit. Explain why the earth won't accept her burial. Explain why every attempt to hide her again has failed. It's witchcraft. The woman was a witch. She was 23 years old," Thomas roared, and the force of his anguish silenced the room. "She was 23, and she was carrying a child, and my family killed her for the crime of being inconvenient. They killed her and her baby, and they buried them like refuse, and they covered it with donations and prayers and respectability for 23 years. Tears streamed down his face. He no longer cared who saw, who judged. Let them see. Let them all see what the Holloway name was built on. "My children can't speak certain words," he continued, his voice ragged. "They can't say forgiveness or innocent or mercy. The curse that's fallen on my family isn't random supernatural vengeance. It's justice. It's the universe itself demanding that we face what we've done, that we lose the ability to claim virtues we've never possessed while profiting from murder." He turned to face the congregation, spreading his arms wide. "I am Thomas Holloway, son of a murderer, brother of a rapist, inheritor of blood money. Everything I own, everything my family has built, is founded on Judith Cartwright's silenced voice and buried bones. And I am here to confess it before God and all of you, because it's the only thing I can do that might bring her peace." The silence that followed felt like the held breath before a storm breaks. Then Grace Holloway stood. The 7-year-old walked unsteadily down the aisle, her small footsteps echoing in the stunned quiet. She climbed the steps to where her father stood, and in her damaged, painful voice she tried to speak. "Judith!" The name came out clear. "Judith Cartwright!" Clearer still. She struggled, her face reddening with effort. Tears streaming. "I'm sorry, we're—" The word caught, held, fought against whatever force had stolen it. "We're sorry." The word burst from her like something breaking free, and as it did, the church shuddered, not a tremor, Not an earthquake. A single, deliberate shudder, as if the building itself were exhaling after holding its breath for 23 years. The floorboards beneath the pulpit began to glow, soft at first, then brighter, a golden light that seeped up through the cracks, illuminating the gap where Judith's bones lay. People screamed, some ran for the doors, but many stayed transfixed as the light intensified and a figure began to take shape in the air above the pulpit. She was translucent, made of light and memory and rage that had burned cold for decades. Judith Cartwright stood before them, not as she'd been in death, but as she'd appeared in those photographs, young, beautiful, and unmistakably pregnant. Her eyes found Thomas first. They held no forgiveness, but neither did they hold the fury he'd expected. They held assessment, judgment, the calculating gaze of someone deciding whether his suffering was sufficient payment for his family's crimes. Then she looked at Grace, at the small girl who'd forced out the stolen word despite the pain it caused. Something in Judith's expression softened, just fractionally. She opened her mouth, and though no sound emerged, everyone in that church heard her voice, not with their ears, but directly in their minds, bypassing all barriers of flesh and bone. You took my voice. You took my child. You took my name and buried it beneath your prayers. For 23 years, I have listened to your lies from beneath this floor. I have felt your feet upon my grave. I have heard you speak of mercy while showing none, of forgiveness while acknowledging no sin, of innocence while standing on the bones of the murdered. Her gaze swept across the congregation, and those who met it flinched away from the weight of her accusation. I could take everything. I could rot this town from the inside out, could spread the curse until no Holloway, by blood or association, could speak any words but truth. I could make you all mute as I was made, silent as I was forced to be. The temperature in the church dropped. Frost formed on the windows. But I do not want revenge. I want what you denied me. To be remembered, to be acknowledged, to be mourned. She turned back to Thomas and Grace, and her expression shifted again, still hard, still angry, but with a thread of something that might have been understanding. You confessed. You spoke my name. You gave me what your father spent a fortune trying to deny, a voice. For that, and only that, I will give you what you need. She held out her hand, translucent, glowing, impossible, and from her palm fell a stream of golden light that poured down onto Grace's upturned face. The girl gasped as the light filled her throat, her mouth, healing the damage that had kept certain words locked away. When she spoke again, her voice was clear and strong. Forgiveness, innocent, mercy. The words rang like bells, pure and uncorrupted. Judith's form began to fade, but her voice remained. Tell my story, all of it. Let no one forget what was done here. That is my price for peace. Thomas fell to his knees. I swear it. I swear on everything I have left that your story will be known. The light pulsed once more, blindingly bright, then vanished. When vision returned, the church was as it had been, cold, wooden, mortal. No ghostly figure, no golden glow, only the open gap in the floor and the bones beneath, now somehow seeming less desperate, less angry, more at rest. Ashford was the first to move. He descended from the pulpit and knelt at the edge of the opening. Judith Cartwright, he said formally, I acknowledge you. This church acknowledges you. Your name will be spoken here. Your story will be told. You will not be forgotten. One by one, members of the congregation came forward. Some wept, some prayed, some simply knelt in silence, bearing witness to the woman whose bones had been forced to support their worship for 23 years. The Holloways were the last to leave. As they walked down the aisle toward the door, Thomas felt the weight of eyes upon them, judgment, disgust, pity, even some sympathy. The Holloway name would never recover. He knew that. By tomorrow, his business partners would distance themselves, By next week, their social invitations would dry up. By next month, they might have to leave Millbrook entirely. But his children could speak. That was worth everything. At the door, he turned back for one final look at the church. And there, just for an instant, he saw her, Judith, standing beside her own grave, one hand resting on her belly, where her child had once grown. She nodded once. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but acknowledgement. It would have to be enough. 3 months later, February 1866. Snow lay thick across Millbrook, covering the cemetery in white that made the gravestones look like teeth emerging from frozen gums. Thomas Holloway stood before 2 new markers in the St. Clement's burial ground, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. The first stone was simple, elegant, Judith Cartwright, 1819, 1842, beloved of God, silenced but not forgotten. The second, smaller stone beside it, baby Cartwright, born and died, 1842. In their mother's arms at last. It had taken 6 weeks to get permission to move Judith's remains from beneath the church floor. The bishop had initially resisted, arguing that exhumation required family permission, and Judith had no living relatives. But Thomas had used every contact, every favor owed to the Holloway name, the name he was systematically destroying, to make it happen. The bones had been placed in a proper coffin this time, with the locket and the infant's remains beside her. The funeral had been small. Thomas's family, Reverend Ashford, Jacob Miller and his sons, and a handful of townspeople brave enough to associate with the Holloways despite the scandal. The earth had accepted her burial this time. No convulsions, no rejections. She'd gone into the ground as peacefully as any Christian soul, with prayers spoken over her and her child, with their names said aloud for the first time in nearly a quarter-century. "I wrote it all down," Thomas said quietly to the gravestones, as if Judith might still be listening. "Everything. I sent copies to newspapers in Boston, New York, Philadelphia. Some published it. Others refused, said it was too disturbing, too scandalous. But enough printed it that people know now. They know your name. They know what was done to you." The wind picked up, stirring the snow into small whirlwinds. Thomas pulled his coat tighter. Behind him, he heard footsteps crunching through the frozen crust. "You shouldn't be out here in this cold," Martha said, coming to stand beside him. She'd aged 10 years in 3 months, lines appearing around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before. But she'd stayed. Despite everything, the bankruptcy, the social exile, the attacks on their children in school, she'd stayed. "I needed to visit," Thomas said. "It's been a week since I came." Martha nodded, her eyes on the graves. "The children are doing well. Grace is reading at a level far beyond her years now. She says the words feel clearer somehow, like something that was blocking her understanding has been removed." "Good." Thomas hesitated. "Have you thought about my suggestion, about leaving Millbrook?" "Every day." Martha's voice was tired. "But where would we go? The scandal has spread, Thomas. Your confession was printed everywhere. There's no town in Massachusetts that hasn't heard of the Holloway murders. Then we'll go west, California maybe. I have some money left, enough to start over. The children could grow up away from this, away from the graves and the curse and the truth." Martha finished. She turned to face him, and her expression was complicated. Pain, anger, but also something like respect. "That's what you gave Judith, isn't it? The truth. Spoken aloud, no matter the cost. If we run now, we're just doing what your brother tried to do, running from consequences. I'm not asking us to hide what happened. God knows I'd tattoo it on my forehead if it would help. But our children need to understand that actions have consequences, that sins echo through generations. That the only way to break that cycle is to face it directly, not to run." She softened slightly. "But yes, perhaps a new start would be good, somewhere we can live quietly, honestly. Somewhere the Holloway name doesn't carry weight." They stood in silence for a while, 2 people bound together by blood, marriage, and now shared guilt. though Martha's guilt was only in being connected to crimes committed before she was born. "I got a letter from Reverend Ashford," Thomas said finally. "He's leaving St. Clement's, says he can't serve there anymore, not after what he learned, what he failed to prevent. He's going to join a mission in the Montana Territory." Can't blame him. Martha pulled her shawl tighter. "I can't imagine standing in that pulpit every Sunday, knowing what's beneath it. Even with Judith properly buried now, the knowledge would poison everything." "They're closing the church," Thomas added. "The congregation has splintered. Half think we're lying, making up stories to explain away our business failures. The other half can't bear to worship in a building that was used as a tomb. The diocese is going to shut it down, maybe turn it into a school or a warehouse." "Good," Martha said flatly. "Let it be something useful instead of something hollow." They turned to leave, but Thomas paused at the cemetery gate. In the distance, St. Clement's white steeple rose above the bare trees, a pointing finger against the grey sky. As he watched, a crow settled on the weather vane, its dark form stark against the snow. For just a moment, and Thomas would never be certain if it was real or his imagination, he saw a figure in a high-necked dress standing in the church doorway. She raised one hand, not in farewell, but in acknowledgement. Then she was gone, and there was only the crow and the snow and the building that would soon be emptied of prayer and filled with other purposes. 6 months later, July 1866, the Holloway family stood on the deck of a steamship bound for San Francisco, watching the Massachusetts coastline recede into the distance. They traveled under Martha's maiden name now. The Holloways no longer existed, at least not publicly. Thomas had liquidated everything, the house, the businesses, the investments. Much of the money had gone to establishing a fund, the Judith Cartwright Memorial Trust, which provided support for unmarried women in difficult circumstances. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough, but it was something. Grace stood at the rail, watching the water. At 8 years old, she'd become the family's unofficial keeper of Judith's story. She'd made her father tell it to her over and over until she had it memorized. Every detail, every terrible truth. She'd sworn to remember it always, to tell her own children someday, to ensure that Judith's name lived on. "Do you think she's at peace now?" Grace asked her father. Thomas considered the question. The curse had lifted after Judith's proper burial. The spoiled milk had stopped. The cattle had healed. The Holloway children had regained all their lost words. But peace. That seemed too simple for what they'd all experienced. "I think," he said carefully, "that she's acknowledged. She's no longer forced to be silent. Whether that brings peace, I don't know. Some wounds go too deep for peace." "But justice was done," Grace insisted. "You told the truth. Everyone knows her story now." "Justice was attempted," Thomas corrected gently. "But true justice would have been preventing her death in the first place. True justice would have been my family facing consequences while they were alive to feel them. What we gave Judith was acknowledgement and memory. It's not the same as justice, but it's all we had to offer." Michael, now 13 and already showing signs of the man he'd become, spoke up from where he leaned against the mast. "Father, when we get to California, can we still be Holloways, or are we going to pretend we're someone else forever?" Thomas exchanged a look with Martha. They'd discussed this at length, whether to fully abandon the name or to keep it as a reminder, a burden to carry. "You can choose," Thomas said finally. "When you're old enough, when you decide what kind of person you want to be, you can choose to reclaim the Holloway name or to let it die with my generation. But if you do choose it, you have to carry it honestly. No more secrets, no more sins buried beneath respectability." "I think I'll keep it," Michael said after a moment. "Not to honor grandfather, but to remember, to make sure I never become what he was." Catherine, 11 and thoughtful, nodded agreement. "Someone has to remember the whole story, not just Judith's part, but ours too, what our family did and how we tried to make it right, even if we didn't succeed." Thomas felt something in his chest loosen slightly. His children understood. They wouldn't carry guilt for crimes committed before their birth, but they would carry responsibility to remember, to speak truth, to never let power and respectability become excuses for cruelty. As the ship sailed west toward a new life, Thomas thought about the church they'd left behind. St. Clement's had been sold to a local businessman who planned to convert it to a textile mill. The pews would be removed, the altar dismantled, the sacred space made secular and productive. The only thing that would remain were the gravestones in the cemetery, including Judith's, which would outlast the building that had been her prison for 23 years. Her name, carved in stone, would endure. That night, as the family settled into their cramped cabin, Grace pulled out a journal her mother had given her. On the first page, in careful handwriting, she wrote, "The true history of Judith Cartwright and the Holloway family, as told by Thomas Holloway to his daughter Grace, so that it may never be forgotten." Beneath that, she began to write, "In 1841, a young woman named Judith Cartwright came to work in the Holloway household in Millbrook, Massachusetts. She was 22 years old. She was intelligent, faithful, and kind, and she deserved so much better than what my family gave her." 159 years later, October 2025, a historian named Dr. Sarah Chen stood in what had once been St. Clement's Church, now the Millbrook Historical Society building. The textile mill had failed in 1903, and after standing empty for decades, the building had been purchased by the town and converted into a museum. Dr. Chen was researching New England's history of violence against women, and the Judith Cartwright case had become central to her work. The story had been mostly forgotten, buried not under floorboards this time, but under decades of other tragedies, other scandals, the relentless forward march of history that covers everything eventually. But Grace Holloway's journal had survived. Donated to the Historical Society by her granddaughter in 1957, it had sat in an archive box for decades until Dr. Chen had stumbled across it during her research. Now, standing in the building where Judith had been entombed, Dr. Chen held a gathering of local historians, activists, and students. She'd organized an event, the installation of a new memorial plaque to be placed on the building's exterior wall. "We're here," Dr. Chen announced to the assembled crowd, "to honor a woman whose story was nearly erased from history. Judith Cartwright died in 1842, murdered because she demanded recognition and dignity when society said she deserved neither. Her killers tried to bury her physically and historically, to make her disappear so completely that no one would even know she'd existed." She gestured to the plaque, covered by a cloth. "They failed because of Thomas Holloway's confession, because of his daughter Grace's determined record-keeping, because of the journalists who published the story. Despite its scandalous nature, Judith's name survived. And today, we ensure it continues to survive." She pulled the cloth away, revealing bronze text, "In memory of Judith Cartwright, 1819-1842, and her unborn child murdered and buried beneath this building to protect the reputation of powerful men. May we never forget that silence is complicity in injustice. May we never stop speaking the names of those society tried to erase." The crowd applauded. Some wiped away tears. One elderly woman, a local whose family had lived in Millbrook for generations, approached Dr. Chen after the ceremony. "My grandmother used to tell stories," the woman said softly, "about a ghost in the old church before it became a mill. She said on certain October nights you could see a young woman standing in the doorway holding a baby, waiting for someone to finally see her." "Do you believe it?" Dr. Chen asked. The woman smiled. "I believe that some wrongs echo so loudly through time that they become impossible to ignore, whether that's a literal ghost or a metaphorical one. Does it matter? Either way, she made sure she was heard." Dr. Chen looked up at the building, its white walls now covered with historical markers and plaques commemorating various aspects of Millbrook's past. But Judith's plaque was the largest, the most prominent, placed at eye level where no one could pass without seeing it. A name that would not be forgotten, a voice that would not stay silent. As the sun set and the crowd dispersed, Dr. Chen stood alone before the plaque, running her fingers over the engraved letters. "Rest well, Judith Cartwright," she whispered. "Your story is known. Your name is spoken. You are remembered." The October wind picked up, rustling the leaves of the old oak trees that surrounded the building. And just for a moment, though Dr. Chen would later convince herself it was only imagination, she felt a presence beside her. Not threatening, not vengeful, just grateful, acknowledged at last. The curse, if it had ever truly existed, was finally broken, not by magic or prayer, but by the same thing that had been denied to Judith in life. The simple, powerful act of speaking truth, no matter how long delayed, no matter the cost. Her name had survived, her story had survived, and in that survival she'd achieved what the Holloways, with all their wealth and power, never could: immortality. Not as a victim, not as a ghost story, but as a reminder that every life matters, every voice deserves to be heard, and some truths are too important to stay buried, no matter how deep they're hidden. In the cemetery behind the Historical Society building, two gravestones stood side by side under the spreading branches of an ancient oak. Someone had left fresh flowers on both, lilies for Judith, white roses for the child who'd never had a name. The stones were weathered now, the engraving worn by more than a century and a half of New England weather, but the names were still legible, would remain legible for generations more. Judith Cartwright, beloved of God, silenced but not forgotten, and beside it, baby Cartwright, in their mother's arms at last. As darkness fell over Millbrook, lights came on in the windows of the Historical Society. Tours would resume tomorrow. Groups of schoolchildren would learn about Judith's story. Journalists would write articles. Activists would reference her case in discussions of violence against women and the abuse of power. Her name would be spoken over and over, year after year. For as long as people remembered that silence is complicity, and that the dead deserve our honesty as much as the living. In St. Clement's Cemetery under the October moon, a wind stirred the leaves and flowers on two graves, and if you'd been standing there, if you'd been quiet enough, still enough, open enough to hear, you might have detected something on that wind. Not words, exactly, but something close, something that sounded almost like a whisper. "Thank you."